where you are, which is great. Good evening. I have good evening, everyone, but good evening and good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. For those that I have not had the opportunity to meet, my name is Luke Sullivan. I am the executive director of the Well Spirituality Center. Well is a spirituality center based here in LaGrange Park, Illinois, which is a suburb of Chicago. And we were founded by the Sisters of St. Joseph. Our mission is to foster a community that is awakened to our unity with the divine, one another, and all of creation, which is so fitting for what we're going to be talking about today. So, on behalf of my coworkers, Jack Rogers and Sarah Keneally, we're thrilled to welcome you all to our program tonight titled Ego, Education, and Cultural Transformation, a Journey Toward Healing Our Planet with Sister Pat Bombard. Tonight, we will be moving beyond ego, embrace spiritual depth, and step into a future where we belong to a thriving, interconnected world. I'm sure many of you know Sister Pat, but for those who don't, Sister Pat is a long time member of the Well community, active as a former board member and presenter and facilitator. And for the last 18 years, she has been researching and teaching a course in value-centered leadership at DePaul University. She teaches in the School of Public Service, where I actually graduated from in 2024. So we have the DePaul, so we're Blue Demons, I think, together. I'm sure when you think of Pat Bombard and Luke Sullivan, you think of Blue Demons. She also recently published an article in the Journal of Transformative Learning entitled Spiritual Leadership Meets Transformative Learning, a Story Out of Africa. And I will add that link to the journal's current issue and Pat's is the first PDF in the chat tonight. And then when we send a follow-up with the recording, we'll be sure to include that link as well. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much for your support of the Well. Thank you so much for this important conversation. Sister Pat, take it away.
Thank you very much, Luke. Uh, as we all know, standard Zoom protocol, I'm now going to share my screen, but great to see all your faces. Oh, Luke, I was going to actually suggest that we take a screenshot, but maybe we can do that a little bit later, just so
Sure.
that we see everybody's wonderful face. And Luke, if you could pay attention to the chat, because once I start showing the slides, I won't be able to see that.
No problem. Happy to.
Yeah, thanks. Okay, so we're all in the right place, as they say. When you get they used to say this anyway. When I used to fly, the pilot would get on, or the steward would get on and say, "If this isn't where you're going, you're in the wrong place." So hopefully, we're all in the right place. And I want to just pause for a moment to gather us into this space with some lines from a poem by Steve Taylor. So just take a deep breath, relax. How far we've all traveled to the present through the journeys of our lives. A million different paths of experience that have led us all to the same place. So do feel welcome. On this slide, I offer our agenda, in quotes, for our time together. There are 4 topics I plan to cover in this presentation that I hope will lead to new growth for all of us. Starting in the upper left corner, and wise, they are the landscape, which is really my introduction, the human ego, transformative education, and then finally, if there's time and interest and stamina, we'll look at some healing practices. By way of introductions, then, a few words about the landscape. Last year here in Dubuque, I met Kevin Koch and read his book, The Thin Places. I highly recommend it. It's just a gorgeous book. But it inspired me with an image for this webinar. In the book, Kevin integrates his personal reflections with the geology and history of the places he encounters in Ireland and in the Midwest. We are about to take a similar journey, but the landscape we'll traverse is not found in the geosphere, but in Teilhard de Chardin's noosphere, what is emerging in the realm of human collective consciousness, described by one author simply as, quote, the sphere of thought enveloping the earth, unquote. Specifically, we are going to move along trails through the noosphere that bring us to what we are learning about what it means to be human and how to grow humans dedicated to their own thriving, along with the thriving of others and all of creation through a holistic education process. In other words, what Brian Swimme and Thomas Berry presented in the Universe story was largely empirical evidence for the physical stages of development of our universe, Earth, and its various inhabitants over the millennia. I'm doing that for the inner evolution of the human, looking for the scientific evidence that will help those of us impacted by the dominant scientific industrial culture to rediscover who we really are as humans, evolving personally and collectively as part of Earth's abundant community of life. The story of what brought me to today's presentation is a long, circuitous one, but two key milestones stand out. Somehow in the early 1980s, I encountered the book Merton's Palace of Nowhere, in which Jim Finley explores Thomas Merton's observations on the false and the true self. By then, I was in my early 30s, and I could identify very well with the idea that there were two people living inside me, one compassionate and one self-focused. The second moment, applicable now, is the cognitive dissonance, a term I learned from Rosemary Radford Ruether, that I experienced decades ago when I read Rian Eisler's The Chalice and the Blade. I still have my copy, published in 1988. In the book, Eisler describes early, egalitarian, peaceful, goddess-worshiping human communities that were later overrun by invading, patriarchal, warlike humans. I was at that time enough aware of human evolution that I asked myself, if all humans evolved on the same planet, how did some of them develop a goddess-worshiping, egalitarian, peaceful culture, and some evolve to worship warrior gods and create patriarchal, warlike cultures? Hold that thought. That brings us up to today, when humanity is in this situation described here by the late Joyce Edmund Smith, a Buddhist and environmental and social activist in the UK. She writes, "It is clear that humanity has lost its way and that only a profound personal and collective transformation can bring about the change we need." Brother Tom Kearney is a friend and colleague in Kenya who once shared with me his formula for transformation. Information plus formation equals transformation. It's the formation part that much of education today overlooks. That's critically important because of what we sadly are learning nowadays about the disastrous effects of an unhealthy ego. So that brings us to part 2 on the human ego. But before I start, I want to take a moment for you to just put in the chat if you can. What prior knowledge do you have on this topic? Please place a number 1, 2, or 3 in the chat. 1 being I am quite knowledgeable and aware of my own ego. 2 being I have done a little reading on the ego. 3, this is all new to me. So Luke, could you just let me know if there's anything coming in the chat?
I see a mix of numbers. I would say I see a lot of threes,
Okay.
a few ones, and then I think one, two.
Okay, great. Thanks, everybody. Good to know. When it comes to researching the ego in the noosphere, the first thing you learn is that there is no single consensus on the ego. Bill Plotkin, Steve Taylor, Thomas Merton, Eckhart Tolle are 4 people that I have read. And this chart illustrates that all of these thinkers agree that the ego is a problem, that ego dominance is a source of fragmentation, whether that's ecological, cultural, or spiritual, and each advocates for a different transformative movement beyond ego. Plotkin through soul initiation, Taylor through collective awakening, Merton through contemplative depth, and Tolle through presence in the now. As I was working on this presentation in recent days, I happened to come across 2 current items related to this question of ego. The first was a post on LinkedIn by a DePaul colleague, Tom Makaitis, about ego driving President Trump's actions. Elizabeth Ann Stewart, who is a coach and spiritual director, responded to Tom, mentioning servant leaders like Dr. Martin Luther King. Well, I have been teaching servant leadership for years, and I replied to her with the comment I always raise in my presentations. Defining servant leadership, Robert Greenleaf said it all begins with, quote, the natural feeling that one wants to serve first, unquote. I believe that such a natural feeling, as he describes, would not occur without a person successfully undergoing the process of psychospiritual development toward maturity. Elizabeth Ann gave me a like. On January 19, 2026, Cardinal Supage of Chicago, Cardinal McElroy of Washington, D.C., and Cardinal Tobin, Archbishop of Newark, issued what is described as a strongly worded statement measuring U.S. foreign policy against principles set forth by Pope Leo XIV. They wrote, quote, Pope Leo, in outlining a truly moral foundation for international relations to the Vatican Diplomatic Corps this month, has provided us an enduring ethical compass for establishing the pathway for American foreign policy in the coming years. Sounds like good news, right? Wait a second. Steve Taylor begins his 2023 book, Disconnected, with the story of a letter that Gandhi wrote to Hitler a year into Hitler's war against Europe. Taylor observes that in that letter, Gandhi appealed to Hitler's sense of humanity and asked him to stop the war. From his study of psychology and ego, Taylor writes, trying to reason with someone as deeply disordered as Hitler is like speaking to them in a language they can't understand. It was pointless appealing to his sense of humanity because he had no sense of humanity. Taylor concludes the fundamental difference between Hitler and Gandhi is one of connection. Hitler represents the state of extreme disconnection. Taylor also argues that our prehistoric ancestors lived in a state of connection without a sense of separateness to their immediate environment or their community. That all changed with what he calls the fall and the emergence of the human ego. Taylor's thesis in his book, The Fall, is that the rise of egocentrism stems from an ego explosion around 4000 to 6000 BCE, perhaps triggered by climate stress in Central Asia and the Middle East. Taylor argues that this expansion of ego consciousness led to warfare, male domination, environmental exploitation, and materialism, all social pathologies absent in prehistoric hunter-gatherer societies. I like Taylor's analysis because he gives us a historical development that, for me, explains human evolution from the inside, from a psycho-spiritual perspective. His work addresses, for me, the question that arose so many years ago when I read Riane Eisler's book about those invasions of warlike sky god worshippers. Taylor says, the most simple way of putting this is to think in terms of the ego. These Eurasian peoples were the first human beings to develop a sharpened sense of ego. And for those of us for whom they are our ancestors, they've passed this down to us. Taylor also reminds us that one of the main themes of all the world's spiritual traditions and paths, from Hindu and Buddhist spirituality, Chinese Taoism, to Christian and Judaic mysticism, is to transcend separation and move towards connection and union. Some of you might recall that I partnered with Margaret Placentra Johnston some years ago for a workshop at the Well on her book, Overcoming Spiritual Myopia. She has made a fascinating connection between her work helping people see better and her interest in helping ordinary people see the information out there in the noosphere, not just in faith traditions, but in every field dealing with psycho-spiritual development. Margaret read everything there was to read on psycho-spiritual development, and she created this graphic illustrating that all the research indicates that it is through this growth process that one comes to a unitive worldview and the capacity to love. As Taylor says, the primary goal of human development, whether it occurs in the context of the spiritual traditions or in a more spontaneous or eclectic way, is to move further along the continuum of connection. Finally, Steve Taylor says this about ego and the human brain. Ego consciousness seems to be related to the left hemisphere of the brain. And that brings us to the amazing story of Jill Bolte Taylor. I hope you're aware of her book, My Stroke of Insight, that came out many years ago. She did a TED Talk in 2008 that went viral. But at 37 years old, this woman, who was a Harvard-trained and published brain scientist, had a stroke. An aneurysm in the left hemisphere of her brain caused the complete deterioration of that brain hemisphere. So she could not walk, talk, read, write, or recall any of her life and identity. So I'm going to pause now because she can tell the story so much better than I can and attempt to share with you a couple of short video clips in which Jill explains where and how ego lives in our brains. So just give me a second to go to those video clips, which I hope are set up to just play. Oops.
I am Dr. Jill Bolte-Taylor. I'm a neuroanatomist and the author of My Stroke of Insight and Whole Brain Living. I'm a neuroanatomist. I study the anatomy of the brain. So I can visualize in my brain the circuits of how all the information comes in order for me to be able to have a perception of reality.
Capitalism was never designed to help you thrive. It was designed to keep you exhausted. I hate that
When we look at the human brain, it has emotional tissue in the right hemisphere and the left hemisphere, and it has thinking tissue in both the right hemisphere and in the left hemisphere. So we end up with these 4 very specific groups of cells, modules of cells, that result in very specific skill sets, resulting in very specific personalities that we all exhibit. So we have left thinking, that is structured and organized, and it's what we call our rational thinking brain. It categorizes and organizes. It has language, the ability to create sound, and then another group of cells places meaning on top of that. I know when I'm being analytical and I'm being structured and organized and I'm planning things for the future, or I'm counting 1 + 1 = 2, I know that that's my left thinking portion of my brain. The left emotional part of our brain has miraculously stepped out of the present moment consciousness and given us the ability to remember things from our past or to project ideas into the future. Now, with that, I can create an individuation as well as the linearity across time. And now, because I have linearity across time, I can learn from my past experiences. The right emotional part of my brain is then, how does it feel to be in my body in the present moment? What does it feel like when I dive into the water and I feel the pressure push against my body? What does it feel like to feel water as wet? I'm not on the clock. I'm lost in the flow. I've got this excitement and I have a level of curiosity. And then my right thinking tissue is simply the consciousness of me, big as the universe, connected to all that is, and this immense sense of gratitude that I exist at all. Oh my gosh, I'm alive. We are living creatures made up of these magnificent cells, and there's an awe and a wonder and this deep sense of gratitude. Once you
Okay, give me a second while I set up the next one.
our own head, I have to have that left hemisphere in order to be a functional human being. But even though my ego center is in my left hemisphere is not who I am. I am a left hemisphere and a right hemisphere. If we are hooked into the emotional part of our left hemisphere that says, I don't like that, it's not familiar, I don't feel safe, that clamps me down and I become constricted. And I can fuel that by sharing those biases with those whom I am familiar with. Then we all become more constricted. We all become more rigid. We all become more we versus they. Yet we have the capacity to say, I am a part of a magnificent collective whole in relationship to a magnificent world. And as we engage with the world in a healthier way, the world becomes healthier. We have the capacity to understand and have a healthy relationship with all the different parts of who we are. And when we look at the anatomy of the brain, when we get that streamlined activity between the two thinking parts of our brain, the two emotional parts of our brain, and we're having a whole brain life, wow, things change.
No, what did I do?
Okay, are we back where we should be? On Jill Bolte Taylor? Luke? Anybody?
Back. Yep, we're back.
Okay, thank you. As many spiritual teachers have pointed out, the ego doesn't have to be destroyed. In fact, this would be disastrous, since we need a sense of ego to function in the world. Instead, it needs to be tamed. Jack Bauer and Heidi Wayman are two academic researchers who have put forth the idea of the quiet ego. In their 2008 book called Transcending Self-Interest, they suggest that rather than trying to silence or erase the ego, cultivating a healthy or quiet ego results in characteristics such as balancing the needs of self and others by developing compassion, a non-defensive self-awareness, and an interdependent self-identity. And these are just a few of the practices for cultivating a quiet ego summarized in their research and others. We'll look again at this later when we talk about the practices, but I just want you to be aware of some of the words that are on this chart, like mindfulness and compassion and humility and openness to growth, reframing your identity. So I'm going to pause here now for a minute and let you write either in the chat or in your own notes. What's one idea to write down for yourself about how what you just heard is either sitting with you emotionally or what you're thinking about it, and maybe even an idea of how you could take some of this and put it into action. So feel free to just pause yourself for a moment, take another deep breath, and think about what's coming up for you.
Someone just wrote about the mindfulness meditation and being present to God who is in the here and now.
Okay, great. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. Okay, I'm going to move along because our time is limited, but now we're into part 3 on education. And what I'm going to be sharing again are some new things that I've come into. And again, I'm not an expert on any of what I'm about to present. I'm just a tour guide moving us all through the noosphere. So you might think of this as a trip through the noosphere on one of those hop on, hop off buses. You know, we're not going to hop off. We're not going to spend a lot of time exploring any one of these things because we'd be here for 3 hours. So, and you can do that for yourself or do it with me at a later time. But, we're just on a tour here. On my trips through the noosphere, in search of research aimed at growing leaders committed to environmental sustainability, I recently have come across 3 approaches to education that respond to this critique by Thomas Merton. Our educational institutions need to see their role not as training personnel for exploiting the earth, but as guiding students toward an intimate relationship with the earth. Our first stop on our trip together will be a brief introduction to the Inner Development Goals, an initiative that launched in Sweden in 2022. Next, we'll take a look at Bildung, a German educational concept that took off in the Nordic countries in the 19th century and that has an interesting connection to the IDGs. And finally, we'll stop to look at some of what's out there on transformative learning theory. Though these 3 educational approaches originated within different intellectual traditions and on different continents at different time periods, they have a lot in common. All 3 of them aim to foster our human capacities and mindset shifts necessary to meet today's challenges. Bildung and transformative learning theory both prioritize education as a transformative process rather than the accumulation of knowledge and skills. But first, as an example of all of this, I want to introduce you to Kyle. I found Kyle on the web, where he tells his story this way. Let's be honest and lay it all out there. I was making $200,000 a year to manage a $20 million a year marketing budget to make people buy more $20 denim jeans. Sounds like he was living the dream of a high-paying job, but it turned out that it wasn't his dream. He said the lack of meaning far outweighed the money, and he became a corporate dropout. But what I think is most important in his story is this statement. I had followed the typical path in Western society. Go to school, get a job, get better jobs that pay more, buy more, spend more, repeat. I questioned everything. I included a link to Kyle's website so you can read the rest of his transformative learning story there. And by the way, we will be sharing a recording of this webinar and also be sharing the PowerPoint slides. So the initiative promoting inner development goals reportedly was motivated by the slow progress globally toward the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals launched in 2015. One author explains that they emerged as a response to the growing recognition that external goals like the SDGs require a parallel internal transformation. On this slide is the 2025 revision of the Inner Development Goals. The framework now consists of 5 dimensions and 25 inner capacities needed to meet the SDGs more quickly. So let's pause for a minute and look at this chart. How many of these 25 capabilities would you say require a healthy, quiet ego? Just from what you've learned tonight, if you didn't know anything more about it, from what I've shared, just looking at those words, maybe there's 1 or 2 you could type in the chat that if you didn't have a healthy, quiet ego would be hard for you practice in your life and work?
Someone wrote just the importance of having a healthy ego for all of them.
Oh, okay.
For me, co-creation skills. That's what I was drawn to.
Yeah,
Like collaboration.
co-creation skills. Sure. Well, the whole collaborating,
Yeah.
you have to be willing to work with others, right? Yeah, I circled 10 of them, just to as an example. All the relationship building skills, the humility, the openness and learning mindset. So that's why I thought, now wait a minute, the idea of this interdevelopment goals, and they talk about it just as a framework. It's not necessarily a curriculum. What I love about it actually is that it at least gives us something to talk about. It's something that identifies where we need to go as human beings and how to grow others to be able to do this work that we need to do. After being introduced to the IDGs, I later learned that the IDG movement was inspired by the extensive research by Leni Rachel Anderson into the historical, philosophical, and educational developments that led to Nordic countries repeatedly scoring in the top 10 of the happiest countries and the best countries for business worldwide throughout the mid 20th century. You may have noticed, she's up there in the upper right, Rosa Parks, the civil rights activist who refused to give up her seat on the bus. She's included in the photographs on the cover of the book. It's because she attended a school in the United States based on the same Nordic secret. It was called the Highlander Folk School and was founded in 1932 in Tennessee. Rosa Parks attended a 1955 workshop at Highlander 4 months before refusing to give up her bus seat on a city bus in Montgomery, Alabama. Parks later said it was her time at that school that gave her the courage needed in that moment. The Nordic secret is Bildung, also described in this shorter book by Anderson, who traces the success of the Nordic countries to the invention of folk high schools in Denmark in 1844. In the 1860s, the concept of the folk high schools was copied in Norway and Sweden and later spread to Finland as well. And prior to the 1800s, all these countries were some of the poorest in the world. Now, there's a lot to learn about Bildung from Leni Rachel Anderson. I'm just going to highlight a few things. Like, for example, what is this German thing, Bildung? It's a German term that actually has no accurate English translation because it comes out of not only the German language, but also German culture, but it refers to processes of learner transformation. It's described by researchers as profoundly personal and self-reflective process, so that education thus becomes about inner change and development rather than the gaining of knowledge and skills. And by the way, I did have a Zoom chat with Leni Anderson at one point, and she told me during her entire education process, she never took a test. It's a completely different approach to education. Bildung is really three things: a tool, a method, and more importantly, a proven result enabling persons to function as confident, responsible citizens, understanding themselves not only as unique individuals, but living within a shared cultural value system and community. So it does two things. It helps them build up their sense of their unique individuality, but also their place in their community. Back in the mid 1800s, it was the Bildung folk schools that helped to move a critical mass of youth toward identification with the abstract notion of a country. They couldn't even conceive of, in their sense of worldview, that there was such a thing as a nation of Denmark. And Anderson describes some of the processes and techniques that move the youth towards this sense of belonging to a larger whole. She talks about storytelling, singing, and allowing the youngsters to express themselves and recognize themselves as part of something bigger than themselves, and also lifting up their spirit. She says they developed a civic sense of self and became individuals with a personal voice and with something to say. Persons who wanted to do what was good for themselves, their community, and their country. And today, this needs to be about becoming planetary people. So how can we take this model and apply it using not just trying to get people to give people a sense of themselves as members of Denmark or members of the United States, but Earth people. Before we leave Bildung, I want just to return to the Highlander Folk School in the US for just a minute, because on September 2nd, 1957, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. joined the staff and the participants of a leadership training conference at Highlander to celebrate its 25th anniversary. And in his closing address to the conference, King praised Highlander for its contribution in the South and to the South of, quote, some of its most responsible leaders in this great period of transition, unquote. We got to do that today, right? 10 years earlier, King wrote an article entitled The Purpose of Education, in which he stated, intelligence plus character, that is the goal of true education. And by the way, the Highlander Folk School is still operating now as the Highlander Center. Okay, to our next stop in the noosphere, Transformative Learning Theory. I was first introduced to Transformative Learning Theory by a colleague at DePaul University in an online workshop that we were doing for African sisters in Kenya. It was during the COVID lockdown, so it was all online. And I was intrigued by the connections to my studies of the spiritual leadership model, which I put all together in that article that Luke mentioned that I hope is in the chat, or will be, the link for it in the chat and in emails to you later, because it will tell you a little bit more about transformative learning theory. But all I'm going to say tonight is that Jack Mesereau is the first person credited with developing this theory, and he did it because he's started to study what was happening to adult women who went back to school, one of whom was his wife. And what's exciting to me is that this theory is really taken off, and especially now is being applied in connection with education for sustainable development. So Mesereau found that adult learning involves taking the very things that we believed and thought as a child and letting critical reflection and teaching impact a transformation. And that he saw that transformation allowed people to become more inclusive, discriminating, open, emotionally capable of change, and reflective. And it's even now being developed into a larger idea that our worldview is changed. The more things we learn, and when we reflect on that learning in ways that help us grasp new concepts and ideas. Again, there's a lot to this theory, and it keeps evolving as researchers and educators study it and practice it. Like Bildung, transformative learning goes beyond acquiring knowledge and or skills. Transformative learning engages learners at the level of meaning and understanding. Remember Kyle, who said his life had no meaning for him, no purpose for him? And this researcher is one that I came across who applies it to developing ethical leaders. Patricia Cranton has this very comprehensive book about understanding and promoting transformative learning. And she's also suggests some strategies to use. And she says anything that opens up new perspectives, challenges existing assumptions, or presents information from a different point of view has the potential to encourage reflection and transformation. Well, that brings us to part 4, which is about healing practices. And we're at 7:17 our time. So I just want to pause here and give you another moment to think about what stands out for you at this point as maybe a new idea or an insight that might motivate you to action. You know, what are you feeling right now? Or what are you saying to yourself right now? Because again, um I'm kind of thinking of this whole thing is something that I'm going into and getting excited about. And I'm thinking of this presentation as sort of the beginning. Um, and where do we go from here? You know, then, what then must we do? Or the Vincentian question, you know, what must be done?
People have commented on the idea of Bildung and how new that is for them.
Yeah, wonderful. We'll save the chat, so, you know, as things come to you, feel free to, you know, put things in there. But as I
Someone just
said,
commented about the personal and the professional, the personal healing and professional insights that are happening from this.
yeah, good. Okay, well, here's some things that I thought about. Teach the whole brain. And Jill Bolte-Saylor says, what different techniques do you use to step to the right of your left hemisphere brain and its ongoing chatter in order to live a more balanced life? Use practices that cultivate the quiet ego. And I'm not going to read all of these, but you know, as I said, we're going to give this out so you can look at it later. But again, it's, you know, what kind of practices are related to developing mindfulness, developing compassion. Like I've for a long time have taught this number 5, practices for reducing ego-driven reactivity when I'm facilitating groups. You know, I have this, you know, this whole idea of nonviolent communication and other techniques that say pause before responding. Jill Bolte Taylor in her book Whole Brain Living, she talks about the 90 seconds that you know we can't, the emotions that come forward to us that might not be positive emotions in responding to what someone has said or what someone has done, those dissipate through our body in 90 seconds. so that if we can just pause and wait for the 90 seconds to go before we respond. And humility, of course, is huge. Teach practices for transforming an unhealthy ego. This comes from David Rico, one of my favorite authors, and he talks about, the face of ego, the fear, the attachment, the controlling, the entitled. So when I feel fear, instead I choose to love. When I feel controlling, I grant freedom, no matter how difficult that is to do. Or when I'm feeling entitled, I see myself as equal. You can learn more about Bildung. Lenny Rachel Anderson has all kinds of information on several websites, but I'm actually going to take a course from her on Nordic Secret 101.0. It's coming up in February, later in February. And she and I have been in contact with each other, and she sent me an invitation to actually take the course. It's not very expensive, but she offered it to me for free as an educator who's trying to learn more about it and can post it. But yeah, if you're interested, you could email me and I could get in touch with her if you can't afford to sign up for it. But anyhow, it's just an opportunity to be engaged with her in a class that at least works, in that time frame, 1900 hours to 2130 is Central European time. So, it works here in the Midwest earlier in the day. Use transformative learning strategies, which are summarized, the main ones on this chart, which are questioning, which encourages critical examination of assumptions. Remember Kyle? He said, I questioned everything. Consciousness raising, and that consciousness raising, that phrase goes all the way back to the beginnings of the feminist movement and the rap groups or the conversation groups that women came into, where they finally figured out that the personal was political by talking to one another about their domestic issues and recognizing that they all had similar issues. Journaling, anything that helps people to process what they know and why they know it, and perhaps why they should change it or could change it. Teach the impact of psychospiritual growth. These are two books I came across in the 90s. Wayne Teasdale's book, The Mystic Heart, in which he did research on people that he felt were spiritual leaders and what their characteristics were. And also around that time, Dana Zohar and her husband, Ian Marshall, came out with a book on SQ, very similar spiritual growth indicators. Teach countercultural values. I teach a value-centered leadership course at DePaul, and one of the things we talk about is the fact that one of the things driving American culture is the emphasis on the value of individualism. And these are, just a couple of images I found on the web for 10 values that make you an American. And so what are the countercultural values? Well, some of them are in Thomas Berry says, communion with the natural world is understood instinctively by tribal people. This is something all our sciences and technologies are unable to appreciate. So an emphasis on, bingo, there it is, middle of that chart, science and technology uh, is not a helpful thing. And Plotkin, in his book Soulcraft, refers to Chellis Glendenning's book, My Name is Chellis and I'm in Recovery from Western Civilization, which I read years ago. I love that book. This is my favorite quote from that book. Plotkin comments that the Western quote unquote worldview, which we now know flows from a supercharged ego, says in essence that technological progress is the highest value and that we were born to consume, to endlessly use and discard natural resources, other species, technological gadgets, toys, and often other people, especially if they are poor or from the so-called third world. And Chellis Glendenning says nature-based people manifest the very qualities that contemporary psychotherapy the recovery movement and spiritual practices continually aim for. A visible sense of inner peace, unself-conscious humility, an urge to communal cooperation, and heartfelt appreciation for the world around them. I was part of the planning team that brought Winona LaDuke to the Sisters of Earth conference in St. Paul in 2006. And in her book, All Our Relations, she notes again how it is through ceremony, song, and story that people are formed and supported in the circles of belonging. So it's not that we want to co-opt or, use Native American tradition or cultures, but I'm just showing them as an example of the fact that the the we need to re-examine what values we do want to use that are helpful for us living on the planet. This is an example of how one native tribe living in the Kenai Peninsula in Alaska is teaching values using their traditional values circle. But we can teach even just ecological values, like the ones summarized on this chart. Things like stewardship, intergenerational equity, respect for nature, ecological integrity. So how do we move from those dominant Western, here in the United States, superego created and pushed values to something that's going to be better for everyone? Teach mindfulness practices, teach reflective practices, organize service projects, spend time outdoors, hang out with mystics. This is one of my favorite sayings from Alice Walker's The Color Purple. But one day when I was sitting quiet like a motherless child, which I was, it come to me, that feeling of being part of everything, not separate at all. I knew that if I cut a tree, my arm would bleed, and I laughed and I cried and I ran all around the house. Finally, we have these words from Thomas Berry about the challenges and hope of our time. We have identified the difficulties, but also the opportunities of what is before us. A comprehensive change of consciousness is coming over the human community, especially in the industrial nations of the world. It's out there in the noosphere. We just have to go look for it. And then we have to partner with the people who are out there putting their stuff out in the noosphere that's positive and transformative. He says, for the first time since the industrial age began, we have a profound critique of its devastation, a certain dismay at what is happening, along with an enticing view of the possibilities before us. So that's it. So I'm here, willing to talk to you. It's now 7:30, so we've been at this for an hour. I know I've thrown a lot at you. I'm happy to stay here and chat. If you have any parting comments or want to hang around for a while, I'm open to do that as well. But seriously, if you're going to leave and you have a thought, put it in the chat, because we are going to save that so we won't lose it. But I'm going to stop sharing the screen and get back to the group. And thank you for bearing with me.
Thanks a lot, Pat.
Oh, good, Vincenta. I'm glad, this is helpful to you in your work information. I can actually open up my chat.
Pat, I'm curious. We had a presentation. We did some work at the Well around COP30 and the climate change conference, and a presentation on what happened there. And for the first time, we learned that Indigenous voices were really present in sort of a real way at this conference. I'm just curious, in light of what we had talked about, if you saw any of this brought to the powers at be at the COP30, or if you see, like, I know that there's like a fuel conference about countries eliminating fossil fuels. If you see a lot of this coming up from the groups or countries in relation to the climate crisis.
I did follow COP30 a little bit with our BVM Loretto network folks, but I really didn't have time to go into it in depth. So I would imagine not, but I'm actually planning to go to the UN in March for the Commission on Women, and it's a question I could ask, of some of the folks I
Yeah.
meet there. But I know it's kind of ironic in a way because um, Lenny Rachel Anderson, because she's so into Bildung and that it's a personal process, she's not in favor at all of the IDGs because she's not in favor of the word goals. She said you can't, this is not about educating towards goals. It's about transforming the person through processes. And so I would imagine, but ironically, the IDGs have become supported by, I'll just say it, it seems like it's a group of very wealthy men.
Yeah.
And it's who are promoting it. Um, like Peter Senge is involved in it, and a lot of people from the corporate. I mean, he in his book he wrote about personal mastery. He was one of the first people to link up leadership and personal transformation. But I'm not sure if they really get that. And they admit, as I said, that they're not trying to create a curriculum. They're just putting this out there. Their main goal is really to start the conversation or get the conversation going around the need for internal transformation and internal growth and these capacities that they've listed in the framework. And the framework was developed as an open source thing. They had thousands of people, write in. I did it. You could fill out a survey and say what you think is needed, and that's how they actually revised their original framework in 2025. And they do a
Mhm.
summit every year, but it's over there in Norway. Um, but you can actually do it online as well too. I mean, it's for me, it's kind of this again, it's this paradox of even with AI now, it's there's all kinds of concerns about AI and from an environmental perspective, but at the same time, it's a doorway into the noosphere. Like, I mean, we use it all the time. If you Google anything, you're using it to find out what's out there, the answer to your question that you're asking at the breakfast table in your conversation, because something came up that you don't know the answer to and you want on it, and so you Google it on your phone and you get it.
But how's that going to impact thinking and creative thinking and reflective stuff when AI just spits out whatever you ask them? And I, I just, this whole AI thing just makes me so nervous. And I was going to ask that question. How's it going to
Yeah,
impact?
yeah.
I mean,
Well,
I know it's
I
huge,
actually,
but
yeah. There's I think there's a leadership publishing company called, or a company that publishes leadership stuff called Barrett Kohler, and I think it was them who had a webinar the other day featuring a woman who was talking about how, because it was geared towards authors who might be writing books for them, how to use AI ethically. She put aside the whole environmental question, but And she basically said, I don't, she said well, she said, you can't use it, um, to be to put something out there that supposedly creatively comes from you. She said, I never copy and paste. I only, whatever I write comes from my fingers on the keyboard or my pencil in my hand. But you can use it to summarize things. So that's the way I use it. I mean, there's too much out there for me. I don't have the hours in a day, or it would take years to learn some of the stuff. And so we're encouraged to use it at DePaul, for example, for research. And there's an AI app that's called Consensus, and I asked it the question, is there a consensus on what the ego is and how it impacts behavior? And the answer came back, there is no consensus. So, and it does that by looking at everything that it can look at, and comes back with that. So, she had a list of like 5 different ways to use it. Like you can, as a researcher and as an author, just if you're just looking for what's out there, or you're looking for gaps in the information that's out there that you might fill by doing some piece of research or something, um, so it's never really going to take away, if you use it properly, it's never really going to take away the creativity that comes out of you as an artist or as a writer or as a photographer. I mean, and I think of it as a tool like any tool. The first image that came to my mind when I was thinking about that was uh, a hammer. A hammer was invented to put nails into a board. But that guy who attacked Nancy Pelosi's husband turned it into a weapon, and it's the same with anything like that. And again, that says to me, the problem is the psychological development of the person, not the tool.
Pat, I'm interested in the comment, and I can't find it right now in the chat. It might have been Veronica who said that maybe these development goals are not so much goals as outcomes of what would happen if we had these transformed minds.
Yeah.
And from my work with some students, like I'm going to say sophomores in high school, I think their brains are wired, I know their brains are wired very differently than mine. I had them in a prairie for 1.5 hours. They came back. What's happening in you? Tell me the story behind it. The first kid said, we were walking around in a community, and pointed to the things the naturalist said. The next person says, no, we were part of the community because we were actively cutting invasive species, the seeds. The third person says, no, go back to the words that you said right off. And he named them all. And he said, what we were doing was experiencing profound communion. And they all shook their heads. That's 2 hours with 16-year-olds. And I said to them, I can teach adults for years and they still don't get it. But you have it in you. Your brains are what? But if you don't stay surrounded by people who get it, your generation will lose it once again. And we'll have to try and develop it in the human species. They've grown up differently. And it's in them, and somebody can help them get it. Now, how do we foster it and keep it alive through the way we educate? And these ways of educating can help to nurture that consciousness.
Great.
So a whole different human being will be adults than we are.
Sure. Because a lot of us who are on this screen, Luke, you're kind of exempted, but a lot of us on this screen, we grew up with Leave It to Beaver
Right.
we grew up with the pre-60s idea of what family and community and country were about and church. Yeah. But they've
So
kind of let all that
if they
go.
can if they can hold that consciousness, I told them, you're the first generation of humans who can end world hunger, who
Hmm.
can end the idea of war. You've got it in you, but if you don't nurture it,
Yeah.
the human race will lose it again for a while.
Yeah, well, at the same time, at 13, I started watching Star Trek and
Yeah.
have watched it and read books about it ever since. So I live in that universe. I
Mhm.
didn't live in, and that was a real revelation to me when I whatever age it was, when I was started, reading the stuff on feminism, etc. And I thought, and there was all this stuff about the new paradigm that emerged like in the 80s and it
Mhm.
suddenly hit me. I never lived in the old paradigm. That's why it was always cognitive dissonance for me. And that was because of my connection to mysticism and mystics and my own mystical experiences and stuff. I mean, it
Mhm.
put Star Trek put me into that world, and and that's why the new cosmology was so important to me because it brought I had been into astronomy too since the fourth grade. And so the new cosmology put my spirituality and my scientific, probably my left brain and my right brain together.
Pat, I so appreciate everything. We could have stopped at any kind of slide along the way and had a whole conversation around a lot of your themes there. There's so much enrichment that you brought together, and so I just feel very grateful. One thing that stands out for me that evoked my own curiosity were Gandhi's letters to Hitler,
Mhm.
just because of what we're going through right now, and I love Gandhi. And so Steve Taylor's book, Disconnected, I'm going to see if the library has it and see what I can learn from that. So all the resources that you gave us are wonderful.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm a 5 on the Enneagram, so that's what you got.
And a new insight for me was when you said around 4,000 to 6,000 BCE was the
Mhm.
expansion of the ego consciousness. I hadn't thought of that in a sort of when that kind of explosion started happening, or whatever the word is, but the evocation of it from the conditions of the time.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, I was so excited. When I started reading it, I was like, this is the book I've been waiting since reading Leanne Eisler for, because it made so much more sense that there was an actual reason, for the
Mhm.
development of these different kinds of psyches on the same planet.
Right.
And I think, I haven't done the research and I haven't looked to see if there is, but in the book, I mean, the book is very dense, but and he goes into a lot of the current um, archaeological and anthropological evidence from the prehistoric peoples and that a lot of what we thought about them as, quote unquote hunter-gatherers and whatever is not really true, but that and it would be impossible to do it, but it would be sort of like the quiet ego people, for example. They have a test. They've developed some kind of thing that, as everybody does in studies like this, they create some kind of assessment that you can take and tells you whether or not you have a quiet ego or whatever. But it's too bad you can't give that kind of test to some prehistoric peoples and see how they would, measure up
Mhm.
compared to us or whatever. And his idea that those of us who come from that lineage, um, we carry that in us,
Mhm.
genetically and
The memory.
yeah. So we have that super ego. or that, not the superego, but I mean, I didn't go into Freud and all his superego and id and ego and all that, but um, just this idea of a supercharged ego is the way I put it. Um,
Pat, Joanna Macy was another one of my teachers, and I felt so blessed with her Buddhist orientation. And she was very influenced by the Tibetan Buddhists, and she would visit them once in a while in India. And they had I want to call it a ceremony. I don't know if they called it that, but it was like the time of the year where they stopped to do these special dances. And the dances had to do with that psycho-spiritual dimension of our being. And one of the dances had to do with slaying the ego.
hmm.
And Joanna Macy guided us in an exercise of a large group of us, about
Oh,
30,
wow.
on slaying the ego in
Hmm.
a kind of a creative form. Like we had to create our ego in a little clay mask and contemplate ego and what that was for each of us. And we had to vulnerably share our ego with the group. I mean, it was hilarious when we all did this together as a group and we were listening to each other, but it was very vulnerable experience to divulge what you have become aware of within your ego. And then the whole dance of celebration, because our masks, they're literally those little clay things that we made, were all in the center. After we shared our own, we would put them in the middle. So you have this centerpiece of egos, and you end with kind of a celebratory dance around them where the ego, you're basically saying through the dance, the ego doesn't have control the over everything within
Hmm.
me. It's striving towards that healthy ego, but it was called slaying the ego, the exercise.
Yeah. Oh, great. Yeah, I studied at Chicago Theological Seminary with Robert Moore, who was a Jungian clinical psychologist and taught us about how, I mean, his term for what was at that time, it was in the 90s, what was developing into a really bad situation in the United States in terms of the military complex, the prison industrial complex, and not yet the White House, but he called it, he said there are people in charge of these institutions that are suffering from pathological infantile grandiosity. That was his term.
Mm,
Mm.
I just call it a supercharged ego. But he, so, and he taught us about the fact that indigenous, like African cultures, the people, the early anthropologists who went there and studied, that they had rites of passage
mhm.
that integrated young men into, the community, and that's what the rites of passage were for. And I've never forgotten the fact that he told us that he told it, whether this was true or not, but one example he said was, so there's this community of this indigenous community of African peoples, and one of their rites of passage is that they put the young men through this whole ceremony and then they give them an axe. And giving them the axe is the ritual piece of they're now a productive member of the community. And he said the Western colonialists come and they watch this ceremony and they just say, why don't you just give them all an axe? It'd be a whole lot more efficient. You know, and that somehow the whole of what we call Western or Euro-American society culture has completely lost touch with the interior. And of course, Wilbur talks about it as flatland, says that the scientific industrial development led to, if it couldn't be dissected and studied, it wasn't important. So anything that had to do with spirituality or consciousness or anything like that was just dismissed because what we needed was scientific progress and
Mm,
technological progress.
mhm.
But it's amazing how, you know, there's a shift going on in terms of the whole movement of people who are young people in particular, and people our age who are identifying themselves as spiritual but not religious. This guy Kyle, you should go to his website. He considers himself, He's got to be a 5 on the Enneagram too, but he considers himself a synthesizer. He said, I finally decided I'm a synthesizer. On his website, he has summaries of books, he has articles, and it's all about self-development. Just he's just decided he's going to be a self-development guru
Uh-huh.
after having a $200,000 a year job that he just
Yeah.
dropped out of. So obviously this is really fun for me. I really, really appreciate it. I read all these books and it's helpful for me to have somebody to share what I've learned with. And so I appreciate that you've wanted to share this with me this evening or this morning. I and this, as obviously I've carried this question about human development from the inside for a long time and found Steve Taylor really helpful. I read Bill Plotkin's Soulcraft and I've read Eckhart Tolle and The Power of Now and um Steve Taylor's was the most exciting for me. And this whole transformative learning theory is exciting because it offers an alternative to an educational system. When I did the a presentation similar to this for Sisters of Earth, I shared the link to the movie Education, the White Man's Burden. And it's just a movie I saw years ago when I was in India with that program Vandana Shiva had on Gandhi and globalization. And it just really impacted me because it was the first film that really shows, and Barry talks about it, that the education system that we have is designed to create people who will move into slots in the industrial system. That's all it's for. They need managers and worker bees, and so they're educating the whole. There was a conspiracy, a collusion between the people who were building the industrial culture and the schools, and that the schools are supposed to provide what the system needs, not develop fully capable human beings who can be in the world in a compassionate and collective way, interdependent way. So somehow that has to get turned around.
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
that, places like the well, I know you're trying to do it, but I don't know, I mean, in terms of what next is the, um, I didn't spend time on this in my presentation, but, I've spent 18 years studying Vincent de Paul, and one of the writers who looked at de Paul's life and his leadership practices, he used the term linkage and leverage, that the organizations that DePaul set up in the 17th century are existing 400 years later. And he set them up by creating linkages with
Mhm.
people who could fund them, people who could, staff them, and leveraging whatever he had. He got money from, there's a story that he kept going back to the king so many times asking for money that the king finally said, look, I'm going to give you this carriage company. And whatever profits come from this carriage company, you can use to feed the poor. Okay, but get off my back. And so and that's what we have to do. We have to start. And that's why I'm continuing to be in touch with Rachel Anderson, for example. I want to create those kind of linkages and
Mhm.
leverages and so, Sisters of Earth, I know, is trying to partner with other people. And we just have to keep the conversation going and keeping the movement going. So, Luke,
Well,
I think we're done.
thank you, Pat. This was so wonderful, and thank you everybody for joining us. I know we're running late, so we're
I'm
so
going to
honored that
add,
you're here. It's crazy to think, but Lent starts in Ash Wednesdays in 2 weeks, and I hope that you'll consider joining the Well for our at-home Lenten retreat. Maureen Wild's leading a program for us in a couple weeks. We have a presentation from a scholar on St. Patrick and Indigenous spirituality, um, how to live our faith in broken times, all sorts of things. So I hope you'll check out our website for that. And this is our custom, as many of you know at the Well, we offer a blessing for our presenter. And maybe this is not just for Pat, but all those who are working to change our culture, are working to shift what's happening in our world. And so for Pat and for Lenny, Rachel Anderson, for her, for the Bildung movement, and for everyone, maybe this blessing is for you. So I ask everybody to mute themselves and sing along with me. Love be with you, peace around you. The presence of God be with you. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Pat, thank you so much, and it's so great to have it, and have a great night.
Yep, thanks, Luke. We'll be in touch.
Perfect.
Thank you, Luke.
Thank you,
Thank you,
everybody. It's wonderful
Thank
to see my CSJ friends and my BVM friends and my new friends here. So thank you.
And a lot